Abdul Salam with BeatsBoxingMayhem.com and also Boxing Insider here with Showtime Sports President Stephen Espinoza. Thank you, Stephen, for making time. I know it's hectic during fight week. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's a little bit different fight week, different energy with the holidays, but It's exciting.
So my first question for you, you just mentioned it's the holidays. So one thing I was concerned about was what the turnout was going to be right after Christmas. I figured that would be a risk, but so far the sales have been going good. What made you so confident that the sales would be good even during Christmas week with Tank?
I'll tell you, when it comes to that in this particular weekend, I relied on someone with more experience than me. Al Heyman and I were talking, and he had mentioned that in Atlanta in particular, whenever the calendar fell so that there was a weekend between Christmas and New Year's, he always did big concert business in Atlanta.
Okay.
Because people might, have some days off, they're looking for something to do. They've been at home, they've been with family, maybe they're looking to get out. So when there's a weekend in between Christmas and New Year's, it's generally been a good weekend in the market. Now, it hasn't been a boxing weekend, so it's a little bit of risk, but so far, it's, that knowledge is sort of transferred. Big, good concert weekend, also good boxing weekend, as it turns out.
Right. So looking at Tank, he's on the cusp of actually really becoming a superstar. One thing I noticed was, you did a lot of great work with Deontay Wilder when he was coming up. Is there any concern with Tank and also with Fox, as them coming in, what they did with Deontay, maybe trying to get a pay-per-view? Any worry about any other networks trying to swoop in with the work that you're doing with Tank?
Look, the reality is, there's always competition. And whether it's HBO or Fox or who knows who it's going to be in the future. Right. So, the reality is Showtime Boxing has been around for almost 35 years. We love to work with fighters their whole career. Badu Jack has basically been nowhere other than Showtime. Tank has been nowhere other than Showtime. The Charlos up until last year, nowhere other than Showtime. Right. But, as much as we want to continue with Deontay. This is a franchise, and we are in the business of helping build stars. Right. So, unfortunately, look, people have to make business decisions, and sometimes that means, we have Canelo for a few fights, and then it takes a different. We never like that to happen, but the franchise continues, and we continue to discover new stars. So at a certain point, we can even look at it with Floyd. Were we disappointed when Floyd retired and, hasn't come back? Sure. Right. But it also gives us capability to discover guys like Tank. It gives us another. So, look, I'm not saying I would trade a Deontay or a Tank for a up-and-coming guy. Right. But that's the business that we're in. And that's why boxing fans love the sport, is there's always a next guy coming up.
I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the great fights that you have coming up with Showtime. All of them are going to be on regular Showtime. Where do you see pay-per-view as a tool for Showtime in 2020? Do you think it'll be utilized, or do you think you can put it on the back burner for most of the year?
I think the right number is probably a couple pay-per-views, because sometimes there's grumbling for pay-per-views, but I think in general, people don't mind paying it when it's worth it, when it's deserved. You have a bunch of friends over. Sometimes they bring the beer, you pay for the fight, or everybody chips in. The reality, it's part of the experience. Yes, it's $75, and that's not an easy expense, all the time. But if you're getting a big fight and a quality card, then I think it's the right tool. The problem is when you start using that as a financial crutch. Right. And toward the end, for example, HBO put a bunch of fights on pay-per-view because they didn't have the budget to put them on HBO. Right. Now, if they're not pay-per-view quality cards, they shouldn't be on pay-per-view. And it shouldn't be looking to just make a profit. Pay-per-view is to make fights happen that couldn't otherwise happen. Okay. And, I think, sort of, I can't tell you exactly how many, because it depends what fights get made. Right. And if fight deserves to be on pay-per-view, it will be. But I don't think that there are, I've seen some people saying, look, we'd like to do 4 to 6 pay-per-views, a year on one network. if you're at 4, 5, 6 pay-per-views a year, plus whatever other networks are doing, that's not a good thing for the sport. That's just essentially trying to make money off the sport, and boxing fans are going to recognize that and see through it.
One criticism I hear from boxing fans is they say, and it's funny, they say that the fighters are getting overpaid, and because they're getting overpaid, they're getting lazy and they're not being as active as they need to be. As an executive, what's your response to a criticism like that?
Well, I agree partially and disagree. I don't think there's a problem necessarily with fighters not fighting enough, especially at the championship level.
Right.
I mean, look, we saw Errol and Sean Porter in an absolute war for 12 months. So put the car crash aside. If you asked me for their health, they shouldn't be in the ring for another 6 months. Right. I don't think that's one where you turn around and put either guy in a fight 4 months later. So, yeah, does that mean that maybe Errol and Sean might fight twice a year in the near future? Look, if you're fighting 2 wars like that, twice a year is plenty.
Right.
Because we've seen it, at least with, some of the tragedies in the ring. You can point to guys who've been taking fights, every 6 weeks or 8 weeks.
Right.
At the end of the day, I don't want to pretend I know, I have all the medical data, but I'd rather err on the side of, being a little more cautious than not.
Right.
So at the championship level, I don't have any problem with a guy fighting twice a year or Tank, 3 times a year. Now, you bring up the money. The complaint I agree with in a different sort of way is we now have outlets that are getting into the sport and they're making offers either, simply because they need fighters and they need content. Right. And there's not any quality control, there's not any interest in quality control. So there's a number of fighters, Tank in particular. Tank's got it, Charlo's got it, the other guy. They get offers all the time from other networks that say, hey, here's $7 million, you can fight whoever you want. Literally, whoever you want. Now, the problem with that is, it makes my job harder because you've got a guy, you've got a whole range of guys, and they're getting, you can go fight on this network for $1 million, fight whoever you want. You go fight on that network, $1 million, whoever you want. My offer is you can fight for $1 million, and you've got to take a real meaningful fight.
Right.
So if there's only one guy in the business doing that, then it becomes harder because every fighter can look at it and say, look, at the end of the day, I can go over here and fight Joe Schmo for $1 million, or I can fight on Showtime and I'm going to fight a much tougher fight for the same money. Right. Now, the guys that we end up doing business with choose to make that because of the benefits that come with being on Showtime and the benefits that come to their career of taking those kind of fights. Because the other thing that we've seen, with this amount of boxing in the market and this amount of sports programming, fights that are not competitive, that are not meaningful, are a tree falling in the forest.
Right.
Like, if you're not fighting, if you're fighting mismatch after mismatch, if you're fighting, all these, no one's going to pay attention. There's too much boxing on the air for people to pay attention to fights that don't mean anything.
Right.
So at the end of the day, look, taking that money and going against an opponent, it's sort of, penny wise, pound foolish. It's a short-term decision.
Right.
But in terms of career development, exposure, that's certainly not the way to go, in my opinion.
Now, you mentioned how segregated the boxing scene is being now, especially at the platforms, all the platforms that we have coming out now. I just always wonder how often, if any, contact do you have with those other networks? Is it only when there's a potential fight on the table, or do you guys kind of keep in contact just to see what the playing field is going to be like in the next couple months?
No, we don't. I mean, look, there are events where we run into each other, boxing writers dinner or things like that, and there's a courtesy with the sport, but we really don't communicate except for those rare occasions where it makes sense and when we need to.
Right.
And I think at a certain point there needs to be more of it. We've demonstrated the ability that when there's a big fight to be made, we will cross lines and do something unusual in order to give fans what they want. So, we haven't seen that very often, or certainly not as much from other outlets. So at the end of the day, I think, the sport would benefit from everyone being a little bit more open to doing that when necessary to get things to do it. And I think, sometimes what you're seeing is a lot of public talk about desire to make a fight that doesn't match up with what's actually happening behind the scenes.
Right.
So the one thing about it is the network conflict is an easy scapegoat. If a promoter or fighter doesn't really want to take a fight or has the reasons for not taking a fight, the network thing is an easy one to say, oh, well, they're a different network. That's not often the case, because the number of times when the fighter and the promoter is saying publicly, I'm screaming for that fight, I want that fight. And behind the scenes, I know they're doing next to nothing to actually make it happen.
Right.
That's really where the proof is in the pudding.
I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier. Now, I do have to say, full disclosure, neither of us are medical professionals, but
Sure.
You mentioned that the damage, you have to be careful with bringing fighters back. When you look at the older fighters, you see, it sounds crazy now, like Sugar Ray Robinson and Jake LaMotta fighting 3 times in the span of a month.
Right.
Do you think the reason why it seems more debilitating now is because the fighters are bigger and stronger, or do you think it's because all the weight classes and the draining makes us more susceptible to injury?
It's a good question. It's a really good question. I think we have to remember that not all the damage is done in the fight.
Sure.
There's a lot of damage that's done in sparring. I think there's no way to really tell this, but it'd be interesting if it were possible to look at how often those fighters were sparring versus how they are today. I also think, and again, I'm not pointing to anyone in particular, but we also have to keep in mind, PEDs and artificial performance.
Sure.
Because again, that doesn't just affect performance in the ring. If you're taking things that allow you to train longer and harder, that also means you are putting out more damage and taking more damage. So if you are now able physically to spar 15 rounds instead of 10, that's 5 more rounds of damage you're taking, your sparring partners are taking. So, there's a lot of dominoes that have effects that we don't really know about. But I think, one thing that I think, Lou DiBella said this a while back, and I agree with him, is, we have to look at just not safety during the fight itself, but our practices in sparring and the training methods to make sure that we're not creating a lot of the problems there in sparring that become only obvious in the fight itself.
Gotcha. So let's assume everything goes fantastic, sellout crowd on Saturday. You have Clarissa Shields, you have other fighters on deck. Who would be the next fighter you would want to bring down to Atlanta that you think would be great for this market?
Look, the three, when we're building a market, at least our theory has been, it helps to have someone who's got a connection to the city, and who's marketable and likable and charismatic. The 3 fighters on the top, I had to have the biggest connection to a city, are Tank, having moved here and being a young star, Broner, who's spent a lot of time here, and Deontay Wilder, just a few hours away in Tuscaloosa. So, those would be the prime candidates. But look, there are also other options. The reality is there's some young guys. Teron Ennis is a young fighter that he's from a city with a great boxing history, but in Philly, but bring him down to Atlanta, he's an action fighter, a really likable, charismatic, future star, we believe. He's someone who you could bring back and build a fan base here as well as in Philly. So I think it is, not necessarily all African American fighters, because I think the other thing that people don't realize about Atlanta, it's got a sort of underappreciated, Latino population.
Very true.
Something that's grown a lot over the last decade. And so, I think we can probably, bring, some Latino fighters and would do surprisingly well here as well.
Very true. All right, so my last question for you, being that Atlanta is big on hip-hop, I do have to ask you, who would be your top 5 MCs for Stephen Espinoza?
Ever? Wow.
All time. Pick anybody.
See, this is going to date me. You're going to know what generation I came
got you.
from. Okay. I've got to go KRS.
KRS, okay.
I've got to go Nas.
That's my top.
You know, that's, you know, look, there are, when you ask this question, people fall in two camps. You're in a Biggie or a Tupac camp. Okay.
True.
I wouldn't, I'll put Biggie closer to my top 5 than Pac.
Okay.
But neither of them is in my top 5.
Okay.
At this point.
Gotcha.
So then who else goes in there? So I would probably say, you know, I struggle with Jay because I mean, you know, look, when you start with those two,
Right.
you know, it's hard to put, you know, Jay-Z in the same category as Nas and KRS.
That's true.
So I'd say Nas, KRS. I'd go with, you know, Rakim.
Rakim, okay.
You know, and then again, generationally.
Right.
You know, I think this will be a surprising one. I think LL is underappreciated.
He's the first superstar. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of his early stuff, I'm not gonna, you know, go down with the ship on some of his later
Right.
stuff. The first 2 or 3 albums, so there I'm up to 4. I think you got to go Chuck D.
Chuck D.
Again, you know, so
Very underrated these days.
so again, that's all generational. That's
Right.
all that shows my age, but that's my top 5.
Appreciate it. Stephen,
All right,
thank you
you
for
got
your
it.
time. Appreciate it.
All right.